Thank you all for being here. I'm Jeff Collins, the 2021 president of NAREE. We have a really special panel on the Champlain Towers South collapse, which happened 12 miles from here last June 24th. We have a panel of industry experts and a really interesting discussion ahead about what the implications are for this for condo associations all over the country and for real estate writers who cover them. I apparently left my biography sheet up in the room, so I'm going to wing this. So I'm going to introduce our panelists. Helping me, assisting me with this panel is Katherine Kallergis of The Real Deal, who wrote extensively on the Southside partial collapse. We have Robert Nordlund, who is the founder and CEO of Association Reserves, the nation's largest provider of reserve studies with clients in over 50 states. And he's based on the West Coast, where not too far from where I am. We have Anna Bozovic of did I say it right?
Yeah, very good.
Of Analytics Miami, and she is the founder of Analytics Miami, which provides long trend analyses of condo and housing market in South Florida region. And we have basically business and construction law expert David Haber, founder of Haber Law, here in Miami. He's been widely quoted in the media about Champlain Towers. He specializes in complex litigation, business law, and represents community associations, which are homeowners associations, I believe. I'm going to start off by mentioning that David, just an anecdote in David's wonderful op-ed in the New York Times about how a condo board is run similar to like if you had an airplane and the passengers elected from among their members 7 people to fly the airplane, but they did not take advice from the pilots while doing it. So those are some of the issues we'll be bringing into. So to start us off, our 3 panelists have some introductory words, and then we'll take it from there in a discussion. So I'm going to introduce Robert.
Well, thank you, Jeff. I want to go along with that analogy. We serve the community association industry, so among our clients, sometimes we talk about the boards being back in seat 39A and looking out the window and having a drink rather than up in the cockpit flying the plane. So that's where I want to go with my presentation. We want to talk about community associations and how they run. They are multi-million-dollar not-for-profit entities run by untrained volunteer board of directors, so of course, what could possibly go wrong? And think of that. The flight crew of the airplane back in the back of the plane, watching a movie, looking out the window, having a drink. So what we get are community associations where the boards are making decisions to not do what needs to be done to take care of the property. We have deteriorated asphalt, failure to seal, waterproof seal things, failure to paint, letting things just plain get deteriorated. Not willing to pay the money to paint the ironwork, and so now it fails. And then we get to some silly kind of things like this, letting a pool restroom get to look like this, or this is one of my favorites, a tennis court. Or I looked at it and I thought, oh, what was that? But yeah, that's a tennis court. And there's a board of directors who made the decisions that led to it looking like this when I was at the property. So since this is real estate editors, need to have a little bit of a cartoon. And what's a real estate agent supposed to say when they come across a property like this? Well, how do you stumble across something like this? How do you say anything good about this kind of property? And then you get beyond the kind of confusing and poor decisions to things like this. Now, I frame this picture carefully because there are Mercedes, Jaguars, BMWs, etc. in this underground parking garage, and the board of directors spent the time and energy to put gutters under the leaks rather than fix the leaks. And then we have balcony issues. Again, how does the board of directors allow it to get to this kind of a status? and this was a short bridge at a property I was on, and I'm not a large man, but when I'm crossing this bridge, I decided to walk across the nail line because I'm going to walk on the structure. I don't get paid enough to punch through a bridge and go into water when I'm trying to get some work done. And of course, that led us to Champlain Tower South, which is a pivotal time in the community association industry, and it really changed the world for those of us serving community associations. When I say community associations, I mean condos, co-ops, HOAs, planned developments, even extending into timeshares. So there's this factor called percent funded. It's something that reveals the condition of the property, and it is literally the balance between the deterioration at the property and the amount of cash they have. It's a nice little balance, and none of these things are really surprises. We're measuring this already. And so, of course, what do we do now? How does our industry change based on what I just described as a pivotal event? Well, I see there being three types of changes: educational changes, legislation changes, and market changes. And let me just spend a few moments kind of setting that, that framework. Let's talk about education first. Very timely, there's a national trade organization called the Community Associations Institute. It serves the condominium co-op HOA industry, and they put out, I was on the panel that put this document together, they have a research foundation, and if you want to get this document, you can just Google Community Association Research Foundation Aging Infrastructure, something like that. And it was a nice report. We spent a few years on it. It was sent, finally published May of 2020, and it says for a building, and we're talking about the aging housing population here in our country. For an association to age successfully, you need to do a reserve study to see what you're up against. You need to fund reserves. You need to spend those reserve funds. And you need to get a periodic engineering or architectural inspection. Okay, does that start to sound familiar? So that's what we said and we published in May of 2020. And so, obviously, we had the Champlain Tower South collapse. CAI published another paper of best practices in October, just a couple months ago, and they said very similar type things. Get a reserve study and update it every third year. It's a perishable type of document. And specifically talking about what's going on here in Florida, take away the power that the owners have to waive reserve funding and then have that periodic infrastructure inspection. And then educational, I was on my first two podcasts this year talking about how does this come to be? How do boards make these kinds of decisions? What's the role that deferred maintenance plays into this? So podcasts, webinars, media inquiries. Being author on that 2020 report, I received a lot of inquiries about how does this happen? And so a lot of interviews, which led to me being here today. And then speaking with a lot of experts on various different subjects, but trying to get the word out. How can we prevent this? It's an educational element. And then we have a book that came out in also December 2020, and we've got a free copy here for anyone who wants it after the session, who is either a homeowner in a community association, and if there's a tie, it goes to someone who's a board member. So see me afterwards if you want a free book. How to prepare for or understand this terminology of reserve studies, which measures how a building is actually doing. And then we get to legislation. We believe that obviously the Champlain Tower South collapse was here in Florida. Florida legislature is in session now. So we feel that the changes going on in Florida are going to be the ripples that flow across the country. So we're focusing on legislation in Florida. There's reserve study legislation in basically 25 other states. So a lot going on, but it will be very significant how the Florida legislator reacts. And specifically, we're looking for two things to change in Florida. One is, and I mentioned it earlier, only in Florida does this occur, and that is the owners have a single budget line item veto power, and that's over reserve contributions. And so you can imagine the board trying to fill up the bathtub with water, and then the owners come around and turn it off. That's what's going on in Florida. Now, if you look at the metrics, this is the reserve fund strength across the country. This is 49 states that I'm showing right here. 30% of associations, very normal, it's a bell-shaped curve, are in the red weak zone. We compare that to Florida. When you allow the homeowners to say, nah, we'd rather go to Disneyland than put money into the reserve fund, this is what you get. 45% of the associations are in the weak range. Look at them side by side. This is a little clause in Florida law that is, I think I can say, disastrous in its consequences. And then we are also encouraging there to be regular reserve planning, so boards are at least confronted with this kind of information on a regular basis. Okay, get to the market response. We realize that businesses have the power. It's not just legislatures, it's not just education, it would be good if, but businesses have the power to do things, to say it will be this way, or I will change my actions that begin to change your actions. And so we're a large reserve study firm. We've banded together with the largest specialty insurance company in the country, and we are now offering incentives for boards to get reserve studies and keep them current, for them to be current, credible reserve studies. We're trying to incentivize the board members to do the right thing. That's the least that we can do. And those of you literally in real estate know that there's this thing we call the brick wall of secrecy. Anyone who has tried to get information out of a board knows that it's very hard, and so it forces prospective buyers into a buyer beware type situation. And without transparency, the boards they basically have only one parameter that they're sharing, and that's the monthly assessments. And this here is, it's been a long time since I've had one, but those little foil-wrapped chocolates, they look like gold, but they're not. So we talk about the fool's gold of pursuing low monthly assessments. When you're pursuing low monthly assessments, nobody has the money to do what they need to do. So you get situations where, of course, there's not enough money, you get special assessments, and everyone's upset, and therefore you have problems in community associations. So without the cash to operate, there's unrest, there's disruption, and lots of bad things going on for expenses that were eminently predictable. Okay, so ask a question. What if there was a national online database of associations and an easy way to discover not only the associations, but their scored ratings, their financial health? Well, this is something that we're currently working on, and we look forward to making a big announcement in the first quarter of 2022 on this exact subject, a market response. And that's the end of my prepared opening statements. Pleasure to be with you today. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you. Anna, so what was the market response when this happened? Did people stop buying condos?
No, not at all. They did not. Do we have the slide thingy? Yeah, so I thank you very much for the introduction earlier. So I'm the founder of Analytics Miami, and we publish long-term trend analysis on the markets. I'm a big believer and proponent of trying to get as macro picture as possible. One thing I always say is that the macro drives the micro, and you have to understand where you are in market cycles and debt cycles, shifts of the world, all these things to understand how forces are flowing and driving what you're seeing happening in front of you. Oftentimes, the things we see in front of us are many derivatives away from the prime driving force forces. And if you identify those driving forces, you can hopefully see where the flow of money, where the flow of people is going to go, and that's going to tell you how you can channel money, channel people, what the momentum is. Momentum is a real force. So when I was asked, I did a lot of press following this tragedy, and I was asked if I thought it would have any effect on what was already at that time a tremendous flow of cash and money into South Florida, into real estate, into the region, and I said absolutely not. And I said that because what is happening in the South Florida real estate markets is bigger than COVID and has just begun. And I don't mean this to be some, silly, rosy statement. Within the context of conversations pertaining to this tragedy, it is actually a positive because the flow of money coming into South Florida truly is bigger than COVID and just begun. And when you have a great flow of capital and money, you can channel it constructively. And if this tragedy did anything was to expose the structural defects, literal and metaphorical, in our market and in our infrastructure, and because we are in the receiving end of a great flow of capital, money, people, intellectual, all of it, we're now in a position to recognize that and to channel that money towards something that's happening. So why do I think this is bigger than COVID and just begun? COVID is basically functioning as an accelerator of trends. Look, South Florida, even before COVID, was already the largest, the state with the biggest quantity of intrastate migration. People were already coming here. We already had tax advantages versus what I'm calling our feeder jurisdictions like New York City or California and so forth. But COVID has made that more so. It's accelerated it because it broke habits. People are creatures of habits. Just because you got the internet into the 20th century, people didn't change how they work. They didn't adopt hybrid work models because all of a sudden they could. They kept the same structures. They kept the same 5-day a week. All the office structure that we have in New York City, all of that was built before the internet. So we had thus far been living in this, what I call the post-World War II, pre-internet reality. COVID came, it caused massive habit disruptions. People stayed home, and then they started to form, long enough that they started to form new habits. Their lives were already disrupted, so now they're like, hey, what else can I do? And it causes the shift. And also negative momentum increased in our feeder jurisdictions. Crime, threats of higher taxation, all that stuff just increased. So I might also say the other points that I mentioned there, I won't, that's a deeper topic, but monetary and fiscal policy was out of control before COVID. And if anything, COVID gave central banks extra runway to sort of go off, to act with impunity and further make what was already an unsustainable situation even more unsustainable. So all of that happened. Whenever you have crazy monetary policy, you get widening wealth gaps, which were in existence before COVID, which has also been accelerated. And we're benefiting from that in South Florida also because we're getting people with money moving here, and that has also just begun. So what does this all mean for South Florida real estate? Just a brief look here. We have a tsunami, what I'm calling a tsunami of cash and holders of capital relocating, and that's the chart. This is through third quarter. So this is Tri-County. It's aggregate residential real estate, condos, single-family homes, and there was literally twice as much money spent. Twice the dollar figures were spent. That's an extra $29 billion spent. At the same time, supply dropped by half, and it was a 31 increase in a quantity of property sold. So if you'll notice, the percentage of property sold is smaller than the increase in dollar figure, and that's because the largest percentage gains are in million plus. What there? Oh, sorry, let me go back. Oops. Yeah, I got it. Okay. 62% of million plus transactions were all cash, Tri-County. That's a staggering figure. That's the opposite of a bubble. That is not debt leveraging. That is people with cash moving here. And demand is up 163% for million plus. So none of that is going away. The city of Miami is emerging as what I'm calling a new polarity of this post-internet 21st century world. And I don't mean, so I grew up in New York City, I don't mean to sound dramatic and say that New York will die. It will not die. The world undergoes what I call a shift in focus. Before New York City, London was the capital of the world. Before that, it was Amsterdam. Those cities are still there. They're still large cities. They're still world cities, but there's a shift in focus. And every 100 years or so, the world shifts. History never stays the same. We all know this. And now we're undergoing the big shift of our lifetime that has been accelerated by COVID. And I believe it will be a more multipolar world that's emerging, that's enabled by the internet. And so none of this is going away. So we have all this cash coming in. Again, it's just some of the precedent post-Champlain where I was right. It had no effect on the market whatsoever. Also to point out, Champlain Towers is an example of old buildings having problems. And the Miami Beach area, that's Surfside, but the Miami Beach Surfside area already had an enormous performance gap between old and new construction, and that was pre-COVID. And if anything, that's going to accelerate that gap. And again, our largest percentage gains are in luxury buyers, people coming from New York to relocate their families. They're largely not looking at old construction anyway. Again, this is showing this is data for even if we isolated for condos below $1 million, that flow of transaction volume and money spent was not affected by Champlain Towers, and that's Tri-County. Now, I actually presented to the city of Miami Beach extensively a few years ago on the problems and underperformance of the historic districts there. I don't know if everyone in the audience here knows, but Miami Beach has this enormous area of historic zoning that people are kind of religiously zealous about protecting. And they're in denial about the fact that that housing is underperforming. It was underperforming before COVID to levels that are staggering. I mean, I isolated resale values by decade buildings were built. Even without adjusting for inflation, it never came close to previous highs. If we adjust for inflation, it's ridiculous. Before COVID, the historic districts, Miami Beach, had median rents within 5.5% of Alapata, which is very far from the ocean and kind of grungy and industrial with a lot of Section 8. Those historic buildings, many of them were built in the 50s and the 60s with small windows, no parking, no amenities. They're not desirable anymore. The city of Miami has great zoning, they're encouraging business, they're encouraging development, and they're getting housing built for all the young people coming to work and participate in our economy. Miami Beach is not, and they're in denial about it. So one of the things that I was saying after this tragedy is that perhaps now, finally, the concept of structural obsolescence will be introduced in residential real estate, because it's a very, very real thing, and I don't know how long they're going to keep ignoring it. And it's people in the buildings ignoring it, the local governments ignoring it, everything. And it took an awful tragedy for them perhaps to wake up and say that these buildings are not going to last forever. And because we have this great flow of cash into the region, we can deploy it. It's a tricky situation. You have people who are not rich living in older housing, and you're telling them that their primary asset and their home is worthless and dangerous. But luckily, we have cash into the region, and that can be used, and we're in it's a crappy situation, but because the flow of money is so big, it can be deployed, and we should use that opportunity. All right, that's basically it. So we're just in the early stages of a major shift. Momentum's not going to go away, and we're going to keep receiving capital, intellectual, and the money kind for the foreseeable future.
Anna, are you seeing the gap? Have you already seen pricing fall for older units that maybe are in need of more repairs, or since Surfside?
So on an individual basis, probably, because people are going to spend more time on their due diligence when they're buying older buildings, as they should. And so they're not all equal. I mean, some will be bigger disasters than others. So ones that are found to be disasters will get their hurt, but you'd have to really dig in building by building. On aggregate, it's not showing up in the data.
This tsunami of cash that you referred to, where is this coming from? I know that South Florida has always been a target for international buyers, but is this new, or is this an ongoing?
Domestic now.
Yeah, the percentage surge is very new. That's a spike of the likes of which we've never seen. Even in the previous bubble, which was debt-driven, which is not debt-driven, but there was a spike in the previous cycle. This spike is far larger. And it's important to note that especially for luxury condo inventory, that has previously been driven by Latin American buyers, foreign buyers, use them as safety deposit boxes because their countries periodically steal their government and they buy condos here with cash and they come here. So now they've not, it's not like they stopped coming, but they're coming in far fewer numbers because of COVID. And so this has been driven to a larger extent than previously by domestic buyers. And now all the Latin American foreign buyers, they didn't decide they didn't like Miami. They didn't stop coming because they didn't want to. It's because they couldn't. They're going to come for all the same reasons they always have on top of this demand.
Well, you're giving us a lot to think about. Go ahead.
I came in at the airport last evening, and my Uber driver said, "Are you here to buy real estate?"
Yeah. No, it's astounding. And now the city's ready for it. Look, if this happened 10 years ago, it would not have been. We already have, Miami International Airport is fantastic. I think we have more direct international flights than any airport in America. The airport is growing all the time. We have culture, we have stuff. Things change quickly. In 1960, Detroit had the highest per capita income in the United States. The present is not sacrosanct. Things change quickly. The skyline didn't exist 20 years ago. And momentum is very real, and we're in the early stages of a big shift.
Okay, I want to, David?
Can you show me how to use this thing?
Oh yeah, press the big button.
Press the big button. I don't know where mine is.
Oh.
Am I going the wrong way?
Sammy, I don't think we have, did you get David's slides? Oh my, so we didn't get them.
All right. Well, all right, I sent them, but okay. I'll do this. First of all, everybody
my
look
bad
outside.
son.
Look how beautiful it is here in Miami. That's one of the reasons why people are coming. Obviously, another reason is because of the taxation differentiation between California and New York, the northeastern states, and the states who are getting the most migration, which are Texas and Florida. And what's shocking about Texas and Florida? No state income tax. Job opportunity. I'm no Elon Musk, but I could tell you he's looking forward to Texas for his company because of the tax advantages. The Florida Bar issued a report in October of this year from a very specialized committee of condominium lawyers and specialists in real estate to address the issue of the Surfside tragedy and how to avoid this in the future. And the other speakers have already spoken about the issue of deterioration in older buildings and lack of reserve studies. So what did the task force recommend? 12 basic categories, and I'll just go through a couple of them. One is to add the concept of waterproofing to structural components. And a building is kind of like the human body. And the paint and the waterproofing is like your skin. And if you have corrosive salt air environments, which they have not just in Miami, not just in the Tri-County area, not just in Florida, but think about it, all over the United States, up and down the East and West Coast, where does everybody want to live? They want to live next to the water. And what's the problem with water? It's a corrosive salt air environment. And what's the problem with concrete? The problem with concrete is it has rebar in it, and it's porous. And that rebar is going to crumble and spall unless the skin over the top, which is waterproofing and paint, is constantly protecting it. What's the problem with waterproofing? Well, when you have a huge pool deck like some of these older buildings, they have massive pool decks, but then they have tile on top of the waterproofing. And the cost of getting the tile off and putting the tile back and taking the plants out of the planters and redoing the waterproofing is very expensive. And what do boards do? They buy 5-year waterproofing, and then they expect it to last 15 to 20 years. And then you see that situation that we saw with the pipe and the gutter, where they put the gutter up because they can't afford to re-waterproof every 5 years. So one of the things I had suggested to this task force was to have waterproofing last 20 years. Because that way you don't have to run into the situation where you can't afford to redo the waterproofing, and you don't have to just put up the gutter, which is obviously not resolving the problem. Another thing that the task force recommended was that any condominium documents that limit or prohibit an association's ability to levy assessments or borrow money for these necessary maintenance and repairs is void as a matter of public policy, because a lot of these older condos have 40-year-old declarations, and a lot of them say you can't borrow more than $200,000 unless, let's just say, 80% of the people agree, and of course you're never going to get 80% of the people who agree on anything. So that was another one. Another thing that they recommended was when the developer gives an inspection turnover report, which they're required to do at the time of turnover, that they have to give a maintenance protocol for all items requiring upkeep and maintenance, and that they also include waterproofing as one of the mandatory components. The task force also recommended that by 2024, all associations will be required to get an engineering study every 5 years. Now, this is one of the most critical things, and I believe this is going to become a nationwide trend. You cannot figure out what you need to do unless you look at your building. If you don't go to the doctor, you don't know what's necessarily wrong with you, and you surely can't fix it. You can say I'm out of breath, but you don't know why you're out of breath. You don't know if it's emphysema, you don't know if it's an oxygen problem, you don't know whether you need nitroglycerin, you don't know what you need unless you go to a doctor. So an engineer is a doctor for your building, both a structural engineer and a fire safety and electrical engineer. And that's going to have to be done every 5 years. And here's another critical component. It's going to have to go to the local government official, who's going to then have a copy of your report and presumably will be able to hold your feet to the fire to get the work done. Now, I do want to say, and I will talk about this a little bit in a moment or two, there's the politics of condominium associations. And we talked about it a little bit with the airplane, but I'm going to talk about it a little more in a moment. The other thing is reserve funding, and this was already discussed. This requirement, the task force recommended, should not be allowed to be waived ever. No more waiver of reserve funding. No more board politics to appease the owners who are on fixed incomes or people who want to pass the buck down the road, kick the can down the road 20 years for someone else to pay for their use, operation, and maintenance of the building. And another item was, and this is an interesting one because they just introduced a bill on this in the legislature in the last few days, which was to get rid of something called the statute of repose. The statute of repose for construction is you cannot sue the developer or the contractor more than 10 years after the later of the following events. Certificate of occupancy, or TCO, one of those two, completion of the building, or final payment. Well, Champlain Towers was 40 years. And the building may have been, and they haven't come out with this yet, defectively designed. It may have been defectively built with not enough rebar. It might not have had enough shear walls going east-west. They haven't come to final conclusions yet, nor should we. But one thing we can come to a conclusion about is there's no cause of action against the developer 40 years later. There's no cause of action against the contractor 40 years later. Now, this is going to impact insurance and insurance premiums and ultimately the cost of construction. Because if someone has to get a bond, they've got to have that bond last for the 10 years and the statute of repose. If that statute of repose becomes 20, 30, 40 years, then the bonding cost becomes more expensive, the cost of construction becomes more expensive, and the cost of the housing becomes more expensive because they have to carry that liability insurance for a much longer time. The other thing that they mentioned in the report is that money should be spent on training and education of unit owners, officers, and directors about life safety components, rather than taking the money away from the condominium trust fund and using it for other purposes in the budget, which the legislature has done for years. Every condominium has to pay a fee every year. They basically take that money and they take it and put it somewhere else in the budget. And that was pointed out by numerous reporters, including the Miami Herald, where they said, how could you have money to do enforcement? How can you have money to do training if you're taking the money and putting it somewhere else? They also are suggesting that local governments be held accountable and liable for defects. I don't know that that's going to go anywhere because of the concept of sovereign immunity, and why would anybody in their right mind want to be a building official if you have personal liability? However, that's not to say that they might not have criminal liability, because there is talk around town about whether or not there should be an indictment of a building official for involuntary manslaughter because of the concept of criminal neglect. Let's talk now about board politics. Directors are elected. Anybody in this room ever serve on a board of directors of a condominium or a co-op? Yeah? Did you have fun? Here's what I call it. No good deed goes unpunished. 51% of the people will always be miserable with it, whatever you decide, and you have to get in the elevator with these people, and you have to see them in the parking lot, and they got cost you at the pool or next to your front door or next to your car. I mentioned that it's like flying a plane and electing the owners to do so. I really do believe that that is insanity. It's just insanity. So one of the things that I have been speaking about is taking away the discretion from the board and thus the politics from the owners who want to sell and keep, as was said, fool's gold, keeping the monthly amounts low, to change to structural engineers and professionals deciding what needs to be done and saying, no, you cannot not do the planner. You cannot avoid doing the waterproofing. You cannot put off doing the balcony slabs. You cannot put off redoing the parking garage or re-waterproofing the pool, which is pouring water into the garage. It has to be done, and I'm notifying the building official that if you don't do it, they're going to red tag your building and throw you all out. And that is a big change, because structural engineers have a responsibility to the public, not to the client. They have a responsibility to the client and the public. So I believe taking it out of the board's hands, taking it out of the unit owner's hands, not allowing the waiver of reserves is going to make a big difference. You're all real estate journalists, so I wanted to talk a little bit about what this is going to involve in terms of future real estate practices. What are going to be the new demands from buyers and sellers? What's the real estate contract going to look like going forward? I can tell you, if I were buying a condominium, I'd be asking for 7 things. The current year's budget, the reserve study, whether reserves were waived or not waived over the past 5 years, the audited financial statement, the amount currently in reserves, any engineering reports performed in the last 5 years, any lawsuits for construction defects against the developer or the contractor, and what are your insurance limits? Champlain Towers had a woefully inadequate insurance limit. One of the things in the task force report was about insurance limits. It was requiring insurance limits to meet the cost of replacement of the building. And that obviously was a critical factor in Champlain Towers, and of course now they're looking to sue other people, neighboring buildings, anybody they can, to try to collect money for the victims. I think we're going to see more sophisticated buyers. We're also going to see changes in the insurance industry and changes in the mortgage banking industry. Who is going to want to lend to a condo that's 50 years old, crumbling, not in good shape, and doesn't have reserve money, and isn't fixing the building? Name me a lender that's going to want to take this new scoring system and take a C- building and lend a lot of money in that building to unit owners or for the repairs. So I think we're going to need a government-mandated, government-assisted program to help these older buildings get their repairs completed, because these people on fixed incomes up and down the coast who bought in 30 years ago when maintenance was this, and now they have, because it was never increased and they never reserved, now they have this much to pay. And they're on a fixed income. There's no way they can pay this. It's got to be spread out over time, and it's got to be government assisted. That's a very important factor. The other factor is the knockdown factor. A lot of these older buildings are, I don't want to say beyond their useful life, but they've got to be able to terminate these condominiums. And developers do need to be able to come in and take this prime waterfront property and develop new high-rise condominiums. Obviously, they're going to be luxury, and obviously those people are going to have to find somewhere else to live. And right now, we don't have that kind of housing for them. We're building the luxury housing down here on the water. And the final thing is, who's going to want to insure a building with no reserves and no repairs? I think you're going to find insurance companies declining to insure some of these older buildings. And that's going to be another impact of Champlain Towers. Thank you.
I wanted to ask on the topic of legislative changes. I know in Miami-Dade and Broward, there's the 40-year recertification, and then a building has to be recertified every 10 years after. Do you see that being implemented, across the country, something similar to that?
So I think when Florida mandates the 5-year inspections, which may start in year 10, 15, or 20, and we don't know yet when it's going to start, you're going to find that ripple effect that was talked about is going to go nationwide. You can't wait 40 years to recertify a building. Buildings start deteriorating immediately, and they need to be repainted and waterproofed every 7 to 10 years, and that's expensive, especially on a high-rise where you have to scaffold the building. It's very expensive. It's not the paint that's expensive, it's the scaffolding of the building and the labor. So I think you're going to see it come down to somewhere between 10 and 20 years, and then every 5 years thereafter, not every 10. And I think you're going to see it go, first of all, it'll go statewide in Florida, and then I think it'll be modeled and utilized in other states.
Is there resistance to any of these legislative changes that you've mentioned?
I think there will be resistance to some. I don't believe like I said, I think there'll be resistance to governmental liability. I think there will be resistance from the building industry and the insurance industry to the removal of the statute of repose. There's going to be huge pushback on that. But I think on the issues of waiver of reserves, adding waterproofing, lowering the termination threshold, there's not going to be that much pushback. That's my perception.
Robert, you were in Tallahassee recently. Is there any other legislation in Florida that's being considered that hasn't been mentioned yet? And how do we get the California legislature and other legislatures around the country to start looking at this?
Yeah, I was in Tallahassee last week. I met with 18 different senators, representatives, staff members, spent most of my time on the airplane. I came from California yesterday writing thank you notes to all these people. And we're going to see some resistance. The legislative process is ugly. Benjamin Franklin said there's two things a man should not see: the making of sausage and the making of law. And it was very evident that there's legislatures that don't want to raise taxes. They don't want to make it more expensive in their state. And these are great ideas, but they are legislators who want to get reelected. So we'll see it coming. I flew to Tallahassee because I think that Florida is a bellwether. It's going to be very interesting to see what Florida does, and I believe other states are going to follow. So my fingers are crossed that some good changes will be made and that we'll see more and more of these across the country.
Catherine, I think we got time for one more question. You got one? You got one?
Sure, yeah. I did want to ask about association, the reserve studies. Are you finding that boards and buildings are more receptive to funding their reserves, to making these repairs, or is there kind of like a short-term reaction that hasn't stayed with them?
We are seeing a nice bump in that there's boards that are going, I don't want our building to fall down. Maybe we should raise our assessments this year. And so yes, this is an opportunity and many boards are taking it.